The Lawrence Massacre, also known as Quantrill's Raid, was a rebel guerrilla attack during the American Civil War by Quantrill's raiders, led by William Quantrill, on the Union town of Lawrence, Kansas. The attack on August 21, 1863 targeted Lawrence due to the town's long support of abolition and its reputation as a center for Jayhawkers and Redlegs, which were Free State militia and vigilante groups known for attacking and destroying farms and plantations in Missouri's pro-slavery western counties. Background: by 1863, Kansas had long been the center of strife and warfare over the admission of slave versus free states. In the summer of 1856, the first sacking of Lawrence sparked a guerrilla war in Kansas that lasted for months. John Brown might be the best-known participant in the violence of the late 1850s, participating on the abolitionist or Jayhawker side, but numerous groups fought for each side in bleeding Kansas. By the beginning of the American Civil War, Lawrence was already a target for pro-slavery ire, having been seen as the anti-slavery stronghold in the state and, more importantly, a staging area for Union and Jayhawker incursions into Missouri. Initially, the town and surrounding area were extremely vigilant and reacted strongly to any rumors that enemy forces might be advancing on the town. However, by the summer of 1863, none of the threats had materialized, so citizen fears had declined and defense preparations were relaxed. Motivations: Quantrill himself said that his motivation for the attack was to plunder and destroy the town in retaliation for Osceola. Quote, that was a reference to the Union's attack on Osceola, Missouri in September 1861, led by Senator James H. Lane. Osceola was plundered and 9 men were given a drumhead court in martial trial and executed. Several other Missouri towns and large swaths of the Missouri countryside had been similarly plundered and burned by Unionist forces from Kansas. Castell concludes that revenge was the primary motive, followed by a desire to plunder. The retaliatory nature of the attack on Lawrence was confirmed by the survivors. The universal testimony of all the ladies and others who talked with the butchers of the 21st ULT is that these demons claimed they were here to revenge the wrongs done the families by our men under Lane, Jennison, Anthony and Co. Lawrence was also headquarters for a band of Redlegs that had initiated a particularly vicious jayhawking campaign in late March 1863. The purported objective of this group was to eliminate civilian support for the Confederate guerrillas, but the tactics were employed rather indiscriminately. As one observer noted, "I believe the Redlegs will kill any man in this country for a good horse, and they have glorified themselves considerably over finishing some unarmed sympathizers." Quote, in describing the activities of the Redlegs, Union General Blunt stated, "A reign of terror was inaugurated, and no man's property was safe, nor was his life worth much if he opposed them in the schemes of plunder and robbery." Quote, it is difficult to quantify the number of civilians killed by the Redlegs, but a letter written from the Lexington area early in the Redlegs campaign stated that the Redlegs had killed at least 50 men, who were unarmed and heretofore lived in peace and quiet. Charles Robinson, first governor of Kansas and eyewitness to the raid, characterized the raid as an act of vengeance. Before this raid, the entire border counties of Missouri had experienced more terrible outrages than ever the Quantrill raid at Lawrence. There was no burning of feet and torture by hanging in Lawrence as there was in Missouri. Neither were women and children outraged. Robinson explained that Quantrill targeted Lawrence because professedly free state men commenced the reign of terror as soon as war broke out, and Lawrence was headquarters for the thieves and the plunder. Collapse of the women's prison in Kansas City. In a bid to put down the Missouri guerrilla raiders operating in Kansas, General Thomas Ewing, Jr. issued in April 1863 General Order No. 10, which ordered the arrest of anyone giving aid or comfort to Confederate guerrillas. This meant chiefly women or girls who were relatives of the guerrillas. Ewing confined those arrested in a series of makeshift prisons in Kansas City. The women were sequentially housed in two buildings which were considered either too small or too unsanitary, before being moved to an empty property at 1425 Grand. This structure was part of the estate of the deceased Robert S. Thomas George Caleb Bingham's father-in-law. In 1861 Bingham and his family were living in the structure, but in early 1862, after being appointed treasurer of the state of Missouri, he and his family relocated to Jefferson City. Bingham had added a third story to the existing structure to use as a studio. At least 10 women or girls, all under the age of 20, were incarcerated in the building when it collapsed August 13, 1863, killing 4: Charity McCorkle, Susan Crawford Vandever, Armenia Crawford Selvey, and Josephine Anderson, the 15-year-old sister of William T. Bloody Bill Anderson. A few days later, Nannie Harris died from her wounds. Survivors of the collapse included Jenny Anderson, Susan and Mundy Womack, Martha Mattie Mundy, Lucinda Lou Mundy Gray, Elizabeth Harris, and Molly Grindstar. Anderson's 13-year-old sister, who was shackled to a ball and chain inside the jail, suffered multiple injuries, including 2 broken legs. Rumors circulated that the structure was undermined by the guards to cause its collapse. However, a 1995 study of the events and affidavits surrounding the collapse concludes this is the least plausible of the theories. Instead, testimony indicated that alterations to the first floor of the adjoining Cockrell structure for use as a barracks caused the common wall to buckle. The weight of the third story on the former Bingham residence contributed to the resultant collapse. Even before the collapse of the jail, the arrest and planned deportation of the girls had enraged Quantrill's guerrillas. George Todd left a note for General Ewing threatening to burn Kansas City unless the girls were free. While Quantrill's raid on Lawrence was planned prior to the collapse of the jail, the deaths of the guerrillas' female relatives undoubtedly added to the thirst for revenge and bloodlust during the raid attack. The attack was the product of careful planning. Quantrill had been able to gain the confidence of many of the leaders of independent bushwhacker groups, and chose the day and time of the attack well in advance. The different groups of Missouri riders approached Lawrence from the east in several independent columns, and converged with well-timed precision in the final miles before Lawrence during the pre-dawn hours of the chosen day. Many of the men had been riding for over 24 hours to make the rendezvous and had lashed themselves to the saddles to keep riding if they fell asleep. Almost all were armed with multiple 6-shot revolvers. Between 300 and 400 riders arrived on the outskirts of Lawrence shortly after 5 a.m. A small squad was dispatched to the summit of Mount Ared to serve as lookouts, and the remainder rode into town. Their initial focus was the Eldridge Hotel, a large brick structure located on the highest point in Lawrence. After gaining control of the hotel, which then served as Quantrill's headquarters during the raid, Quantrill's force broke into smaller groups that fanned out throughout the town. Over a 4-hour period, the raiders pillaged and set fire to the town and killed much of its adult male population. Quantrill's men burned to the ground a quarter of the buildings in Lawrence, including all but 2 businesses. They looted most of the banks and stores and killed between 185 and 200 men and boys. According to an 1897 account, among the dead were 18 of 23 unmustered army recruits. By 9 a.m., the raiders were on the way out of town, evading the few units that came in pursuit, and eventually splitting up so as to avoid Union pursuit of a unified column into Missouri. The raid was less a battle than a mass execution. 2 weeks prior to the raid, a Lawrence newspaper boasted, "Lawrence has ready for any emergency over 500 fighting men, every one of who would like to see." However, a squad of soldiers temporarily stationed in Lawrence had returned to Fort Leavenworth, and due to the surprise, swiftness, and fury of the initial assault, the local militia was unable to assemble and mount a defense. Most of the victims of the raid were unarmed when gunned down. With revenge a principal motive, Quantrill's raiders entered Lawrence with lists of men to be killed and buildings to be burned. Senator James H. Lane was at the top of the list. Lane was a military leader and chief political proponent of the jayhawking raids that had cut a swath of death, plundering, and arson through western Missouri in the early months of the Civil War. Lane escaped death by racing through a cornfield in his nightshirt. John Spear had been put into the newspaper business by Lane, was one of Lane's chief political backers, and was also on the list. Spear likewise escaped execution, but 2 of his sons were killed in the raid. Spear's youngest son, 15-year-old Billy, may have been included on the death lists, but he was released by Quantrill's men after giving them a false name. The Spear boy later shot one of the raiders during their exit from Lawrence, causing one of the few casualties among Quantrill's command while in Lawrence. Charles L. Robinson, first governor of Kansas and a prominent abolitionist, may also have been on the list, though he maintained he was spared because Quantrill respected his efforts to keep peace on the border at the start of the war. While many of the victims of the raid had been specifically targeted beforehand, executions were more indiscriminate among segments of the raiders, particularly Todd's band that operated in the western part of Lawrence. The men and boys riding with Bloody Bill Anderson also accounted for a disproportionate number of the Lawrence dead. The raid devolved into extreme brutality. The survivors reported that one man was shot while in the arms of his pleading wife, that another was killed with a toddler in his arms, that a group of men who had surrendered under assurances of safety were then gunned down, and that a pair of men were abandoned, forced into a burning building where they died in horrible agony. Another dramatic story was told in a letter written on September 7, 1863 by H. M. Simpson, whose entire family narrowly escaped death by hiding in a nearby cornfield as the massacre raged all around them. "My father was very slow to get into the cornfield. He was so indignant at the ruffians that he was unwilling to retreat before them. My little children were in the field 3 hours. They seemed to know that if they cried the noise would betray the parents' whereabouts and Amp, so they kept as still as mice. The baby was very hungry and Amp. I gave her an ear of raw green corn which she ate ravenously." The youth of some of the victims is often characterized as a particularly reprehensible aspect of the raid. Bobby Martin is generally cited as being the youngest victim. Some histories of the raid state he was 12 years old, while others state he was 14. Most accounts state he was wearing a Union soldier uniform, a clothing made from his father's uniform. Some state he was carrying a musket and cartridges. Most of Quantrill's guerrilla fighters were teenagers. One of the youngest was Riley Crawford, who was 13 when brought by his mother to Quantrill after her husband was shot and her home burned by Union soldiers. Aftermath. The Lawrence Massacre was one of the bloodiest events in the history of Kansas. The Plymouth Congregational Church in Lawrence survived the attack, but a number of its members were killed and records destroyed. A day after the attack, the surviving citizens of Lawrence lynched a member of Quantrill's raiders caught in the town. On August 25, General Ewing authorized General Order No. 11 evicting thousands of Missourians in 4 counties from their homes near the Kansas border. Virtually everything in these counties was then systematically burned to the ground. The action was carried out by the infamous Jayhawker, Charles "Doc" Jennison. Jennison's raids into Missouri were thorough and indiscriminate, and left 5 counties in western Missouri wasted, save for the standing brick chimneys of the 2-story period houses, which are still called Jennison monuments in those parts. A Missouri abolitionist and preacher described the role of the Lawrence Massacre in the region's descent into the horror of total war on the civilian population of Kansas and Missouri. Viewed in any light, the Lawrence Raid will continue to be held as the most infamous event of the uncivil war. The work of destruction did not stop in Kansas. The cowardly criminality of this spiteful reciprocity lay in the fact that each party knew, but did not care, that the consequences of the violent acts would fall most heavily upon their own helpless friends. Jennison in 1861 rushed into Missouri when there was no one to resist, and robbed and killed and sneaked away with his spoils, and left the Union people of Missouri to bear the vengeance of his crimes. Quantrill in 1863 rushed into Lawrence, Kansas, when there was no danger, and killed and robbed and sneaked off with his spoils, leaving helpless women and children of his own side to bear the dreadful vengeance invoked by the raid. So the Lawrence Raid was followed by swift and cruel retribution, falling, as usual in this border warfare, upon the innocent and helpless, rather than the guilty ones. Quantrill left Kansas with the loss of 1 man. The Kansas troops followed him at a respectful distance, and visited dire vengeance on all western Missouri. Unarmed old men and boys were accused and shot down, and homes with the now meager comforts were burned, and helpless women and children turned out with no provision for the approaching winter. The number of those killed was never reported, as they were scattered all over western Missouri. The city seal of Lawrence commemorates Quantrill's attack with its depiction of a phoenix rising from the ashes of the burned city. For his part, Quantrill led his men south to Texas for the winter. By the next year, the raiders had disintegrated as a unified force, so were unable to achieve similar successes. William Quantrill died of wounds received in Kentucky in 1865, with only a few staunch supporters left. Among these appear to have been Frank James and his younger brother, Jesse James. In popular media, the Lawrence Massacre is a central episode in Wildwood Boys, a biographical novel about Bloody Bill Anderson by James Carlos Blake. In the USA Network dramedy Psych, the fictional Battle of Piper's Cove, reenacted in the 2006 episode Weekend Warriors, seems to be based on the Lawrence Massacre. The battle is also depicted in the Steven Spielberg-produced 2005 miniseries Into the Western in Ang Lee's 1999 film Ride with the Devil, plus the Audie Murphy western Kansas Raiders. The 1940 film Dark Command, based on a novel of the same name, is a fictionalized account of the events in much more of a classic B-movie western style. The films star John Wayne, Roy Rogers, Gabby Hayes, and Walter Pidgeon, but bore no resemblance to the events of history. The 1979 TV movie The Legend of the Golden Gun was about chasing down Quantrill and had some fiction in about Custer. The 2010 Coen brothers film True Grit includes a scene in which the characters played by Jeff Bridges and Matt Damon argue about Quantrill. Damon's Texas Ranger calls him a murderer. Bridges' U.S. Marshal, who rode with Quantrill, calls him a patriot. Damon ends the argument after Bridges refers to Captain Quantrill, ridiculing the title, Captain of what? Quote, "This conversation appeared first in Charles Porter's book of the same name published in 1968. The same exchange existed in the original 1969 film. According to the Misty Boland and Jeremy Osborne, the 2016 web series Red Bird is loosely based on the Lawrence Massacre.